Hi, I'm Jeff Jones in the UNCG History Department, and I'm here to discuss today the Russian-Georgian conflict that erupted in August of 2008. To help you better understand that conflict between Russia and Georgia, I think it's important to start with the long-term historical background. Then I'd like to go over the recent background, the last 20 years or so, but also some important developments within the last 3 to 5 years. And then finally, of course, last but not least, fill you in on the incident itself. First of all, where the heck is Georgia, right? When the conflict began, a friend from Atlanta called to tell me that gun stores in Alabama had sold out of all guns and ammunition. People there had heard that Russia invaded Georgia and they were getting ready in case they were next. Thankfully, though, it is not that Georgia. The capital of Georgia in the Caucasus is Tbilisi. Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan are the three countries of the Caucasus region. There are numerous smaller ones as well, such as Chechnya. Georgia, a former Soviet republic, is slightly smaller than South Carolina. It has been an independent country now for almost 20 years. Georgia, by the way, the term itself is a very bad translation. In Russian, it's Gruzia, but the natives of the country themselves call it Sakartvelo. So how they got Georgia out of that, I'm not exactly sure. The mountainous terrain of the Caucasus has contributed to the region's tremendous ethnic diversity by separating and isolating groups of people. That's actually very common of mountainous areas everywhere else in the world as well. Notice how the terrain of the Caucasus is very, very mountainous indeed, and Georgia itself, of course, is part of that. The high Surami mountain range in the west separates that part of Georgia, Abkhazia, from the rest of the country as well. So who are the Georgians? In linguistic terms, in terms of language, they are very unique to the region. That is, Georgian is not part of the broader Indo-European or Altaic family of languages. It is, in fact, part of what is called the Ibero-Caucasian family of languages. The Georgian people, as Ronald Sunni, a prominent historian, notes, have in all probability been settled in this territory of the Caucasus from the most ancient times. The other interesting point about Georgia's early history is that it becomes Christian very, very early in its history, long before the Russians, by the way, under the influence, that is for Georgia, of the Byzantine Empire. The earliest evidence of Christianity in Georgia dates to the early 4th century, full 600 years before Russia would convert to Christianity. With the rise of Turkish power in the region, Georgia was absorbed by the expansionist Ottoman Empire by the late 16th century. It remained a Christian state within a Muslim empire. Ottoman rulers were mostly tolerant of non-Muslim minorities. With the decline of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th and early 20th century, note that Russia gains control of Abkhazia earlier in 1829, and the rise of the neighboring Russian Empire, Georgia fell under Russian control by the mid-1800s or so. The Russian world itself was, of course, turned upside down by the 1917 revolution. For a few years during the early Soviet period, Georgia was an independent state, 1918 to 1921, ruled by the Mensheviks, the socialist opposition to Lenin's Bolshevik Party. None other than Stalin himself, a native Georgian, was sent there to deal with the problem of Georgia's Menshevik leadership, which he did very brutally. By 1921, Georgia's short-lived independence was lost, and it was reabsorbed back into the newly formed Soviet Empire. Finally, aside from the ethnic Georgians, who are the Abkhazians and the Ossetians? Both of these are distinct non-Georgian ethnic groups whose native languages differ. Note that the Ossetians, or Ossetians, speak a Persian or Iranian-based language and tend to look to Russia for protection from what they see as a hostile Georgian state. There are also greater religious differences in both Abkhazia and Ossetia compared to Georgia, as in those two regions, Islam made greater inroads over the years. Estimated 20% or so of Abkhazians are Muslim, and probably about that same number of Ossetians as well, although in both cases, Eastern Orthodox Christianity remains the majority religion. As to the recent background of the current crisis, let me start with the collapse of the USSR in 1991. Even before that, in the late 1980s, fighting had begun in both Ossetia and Abkhazia, as those regions did not want to be part of an independent Georgia. Georgia's first president, Zviad Gamsukhardia, elected in May 1991, was an ardent Georgian nationalist. One of his first moves as president, in fact, was to dissolve the Ossetian and Abkhazian autonomous regions and required that Georgian be the official language there and taught in schools. When met with opposition, he sent in the newly formed Georgian army to fight rebels in both Ossetia mostly, but also Abkhazia to a lesser degree, who were fighting with Russian support to break away from Georgian control. The war became unpopular with the Georgian people, and in October 1992, Gamsukhardia lost out in an election to a Soviet-era Georgian political leader, Edward Shevardnadze, a former Soviet foreign minister under Gorbachev in the 80s. This sparked a civil war among militias loyal to those two leaders. Meanwhile, fighting also continued in Ossetia and Abkhazia. This was a very chaotic time and situation in the newly independent Georgia, to say the least. Shevardnadze eventually emerged victorious and subsequently dominated Georgian politics for the next decade. Gamsukhardia died under mysterious circumstances in 1993. Either troops loyal to Shevardnadze killed him or he killed himself. We just don't know for sure. Shevardnadze brokered a peace agreement in Abkhazia and Ossetia that allowed for the deployment of Russian peacekeeping troops in both areas and granted both of them relative autonomy. But nonetheless, tensions over the years have remained high. Shevardnadze, by the way, worked closely with Moscow and saw Russia's role as mostly positive and crucial to Georgia. This difference between he and Gamsukhardia regarding Russia's role reflects the two lines in Georgian politics: the ardent nationalist, anti-Russian line, which tends to be, by implication, more pro-Western and pro-U.S., versus the more pro-Moscow line. This is, of course, not necessarily new in Georgian politics. It was the same when Stalin came down to bring the Georgian Mensheviks in line during the Civil War era. Amid growing economic problems earlier this decade and accusations of corruption, Shevardnadze resigned in 2003, clearing the way for the election of Georgia's current president, Mikhail Saakashvili, of the United National Movement. He's a very U.S.-educated, pro-Western ruler. His emergence amid massive street protest against Shevardnadze was called the Rose Revolution, and the Russian government under Vladimir Putin was not happy about it at all. One of Saakashvili's controversial moves, by the way, was to bring the body of the ardent Georgian nationalist and first president Gamsukhardia back to Georgia from Chechnya, where he was considered a hero and buried with honors because of his anti-Russian stance, and to have him reburied at a memorial as a national hero in 2007. This sent a clear Georgian nationalist anti-Russian message. Saakashvili has been very pro-U.S. Here he is meeting with George W. Bush in Tbilisi in 2005. Georgia, by the way, was one of those countries with troops in Iraq until the 2008 conflict with Russia, when those troops were withdrawn. But his rule has not always been entirely democratic. In November 2007, he ordered riot police to use force against anti-government protesters in the streets of Tbilisi. They were protesting against government corruption. He declared a state of emergency, clamping down on media outlets critical of the government. Even the Bush administration criticized this move. Amid the crisis, Saakashvili agreed to resign and call for early elections, which he subsequently won in January 2008 with 53% of the popular vote. He is thus now in his second term as president of Georgia. Let me highlight 6 points with regard to the crisis as it unfolded. 1, the timing. As you all know, the fighting began at almost the same time as the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics on August 8, 2008, while Putin was away in Beijing with U.S. President George Bush, by the way, and current Russian President Dmitry Medvedev was on vacation. On the evening of August 7th, previously minor skirmishes along the border between Georgian troops and Ossetian militia forces for about a week turned into a full-scale war when Georgia invaded the Ossetian capital, Tsingtali. Russia responded strongly, moving Georgian troops out of not only Ossetia, but also moving into and heavily bombing parts of Georgia proper. The Russians also opened a two-front war as well by attacking through Abkhazia at the same time. Interestingly, according to U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, this was the 4th year in a row that there was fighting along the border of Ossetia and Georgia. The difference was that this time the Russians intervened and responded with disproportionate force. The Russian news media portrayed their actions as humanitarian and necessary due to Georgian aggression against the people of Ossetia, a narrative that won a lot of support among the Russian people for the Russian government's actions. 2. A very key part of this is the possibility of NATO expansion into Georgia. Saakashvili has been calling for this for several years, much to the consternation of Putin and the Russians. And the Bush administration had also supported the idea, along with also adding Ukraine, by the way, since the last NATO expansion back in 2004. European members of NATO, however, opposed the idea, and it has yet to gain much support as a result. I think Putin was sending a clear message here: no NATO in Georgia or Ukraine. Indeed, think about it this way: if Georgia were now a NATO member, the U.S. and other NATO member states would have been obligated to come to its defense in that war against Russia. 3, a lesser known factor that I think is very key in all of this is Kosovo, which declared its independence from Serbia in the Balkans region of Eastern Europe in February 2008, very much against the opposition of Russia and Serbia. Here, Serbian protesters are attacking the U.S. Embassy in Belgrade. Russia and Serbia refuse to recognize Kosovar independence, although it is now a done deal. Putin implied at the time that this opened the door for the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia as well. I think it's a very important part of what's going on there. 4, another interesting tidbit: since around 2003, Russia has been pursuing a policy whereby Ossetians in South Ossetia and Abkhazians can obtain Russian citizenship. Putin then used this as a part of the reason to invade Georgia, to protect Russian citizens. 5, in addition, the politics of oil are involved here as elsewhere. A new gas pipeline, funded mainly by BP, or British Petroleum, and completed in 2005, bypasses a long existing Russian pipeline to the north, weakening Russia's control over this vitally important strategic resource. Putin and company were definitely not happy about this. Finally, I think also that there is a bit of flexing of military muscle and might on the part of the Russian government here as well, which is projecting an image of strength. This image, along with the fact that it was portrayed as a humanitarian act by the Russian media, has a strong nationalistic appeal for the Russian people. Russia has quietly built up its military strength over the past few years. This is not the same Russian army that lost the war to Chechnya in the mid-90s when Yeltsin was still president. And I believe that that was an intentional part of the message sent by the Russian government and Putin and company there. There are not any vitally important natural resources in either region, oil, or, as the case may be. So why the invasion? I think importantly, part of it is to abrogate territorial loss from an already small state. And secondly, I think that the mountains to the north are considered important strategically for security reasons, in that they offer some protection from an invasion from Russia, although not that much as the incident revealed. The Caucasus historically have fluctuated back and forth between Roman, Byzantine control and Persian control for much of the ancient period, but with a great deal of autonomy no matter who was in charge nominally, at least in large part because of the mountainous terrain and peripheral locale. The conflict itself actually began, or the earliest roots of it one might trace back to August 1st of 2008, when a Georgian military vehicle was hit by a roadside bomb planted by Ossetian rebels on the Georgian side of the border. That led to shooting across the border on a pretty much daily basis for about a week that gradually escalated until on the evening of August 7th, Georgian troops bombed and invaded the Ossetian capital Tsinvali, and Russia responded strongly the following day with an invasion of Georgia.